Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to ELO Heaven. I'm joined with my co-host for this show, Vu. We're gonna bring you guys to the pearly gates of real talk in Counter-Strike. There's just not enough of it, and we're gonna be breaking down the Blast Premier Fall Series, epic run of playoffs from some of the best teams in the world. And of course, just to start us off here, figure we could talk about some of the general gist, the general themes, the general things that we all thought about. My personal take, we talked about this a little bit before going live, was mousesports bombing out so early, and this is something that happened pretty early on in the event itself. So I'm curious as to your take so far on this. Obviously, there's been so many games, especially before this event, but even during this event, everything being so many series long. But mousesports, you only had to watch 4 of them, and they were pretty short games, so not really that much to not really that much to analyze in that sense. So I'm curious as to your take so far, given that they did face the finalists of this event early on.
They played the finalist, obviously, but you gotta bring them to double digits. Like if they lose, 4 close maps, even losing 4 close maps, getting 2-0'd twice is like not really what you're looking for. But it's not the end of the world, right? But if you're losing, I think they didn't pass 8 rounds. That's not what you're looking for. And when I look at like mousesports, they won. Well, they won a tournament and then they came second to the following tournament, as I believe the way this one went. Granted, they did play Godsent and Cloud9 5 times out of like 10 best of 3 series in those 2 tournaments. I think they did kind of come up with something, a little bit unique on Inferno specifically. They went on a 7 or 8 map win streak on it. And then I think other teams are it's just too easy to steal stuff. When you look at like the way Kerrigan has done things, he's always been able to come up with like unique ways to go around a map. I think Kerrigan's the first person I saw throw the very well-known banana smoke on Inferno, the one you bounce off of half wall, puts out the Molotov, and you can go around it to attack top banana. Every team runs that. Kerrigan was the first team to come up with that that I've seen, right? Maybe some other team came up with it, but they kind of brought it to popularity. And that was huge. That was instrumental in their run at the end of the year. They were really strong on Inferno, catching a lot of teams off guard with that. It was something unique. They've come up with something on Train before, a bounce smoke to put out the molly on Train that allows them to get a lot of space. In TCon, they've come up with a lot of different things, but now you see teams, there's 2 events, there's a few days, everyone knows exactly what they did, exactly how they're doing it, and everyone's going to steal it. And I'm not sure, you can see if you watch Inferno in this event, especially from teams like Vitality, the way they ran it against Astralis in the finals, super mid heavy, right? They're super like committing to mid fights. They're not letting mid go the way of Astralis in that final. I think that's something I saw it first from mousesports again. I haven't looked at, too many other teams, so it's possible another team came up with it. But, if mousesports did come up with that, if that's the way they adjusted, started doing really well on Inferno. I mean, they 16-3'd Astralis in DreamHack Masters Winter. And then other teams just steal it like a week later. When you're on LAN, there's just not enough time. I think it takes a few weeks, a few months maybe. But, online, a few days, like that's got to contribute to why mousesports has been struggling.
On the Kerrigan angle specifically, he's obviously been starting up his own YouTube channel where he actually goes through some of the things that maybe not he specifically does, but he tries to impart some of the knowledge that he's built up over the years. And while I feel like it's kind of like searching for a needle in a haystack, I would probably be on that channel trying to like get a little bit of useful nuggets of knowledge every now and then, if possible, because there are some times where he'll, maybe intentionally, maybe he doesn't care about this particular detail, but he might say something about like how his team plays or one of the strategies that he found, or he might talk about counterplay to a strategy that maybe he currently runs, but just doesn't leak that he currently runs it. And then sort of like those kinds of useful nuggets of knowledge that you might actually get out of watching some of his videos as a competitor to him. So, well, I'm not going to, go crazy and say that that's a big deal about as to why he's fallen off. Obviously, there was a gap between the most recent tournament that mousesports featured in and this one, so that could certainly contribute towards the accumulation of data against the mousesports squad. It just feels like it's one other thing that you can point to as like, oh, Kerrigan might be playing a little loose with the data that he puts out there. He's obviously he went on a strat book very recently to talk about some stuff related to his team and obviously the FaZe Clan team of the past. But there's plenty of different things where if you're getting him on in a context where he's going to talk about the nitty gritty details of some of the strategies that he runs or some flaws that he might see in other strategies, you kind of get a window that you don't get into very many top tier IGLs, pretty much any other top tier IGL in the current world. So, Kerrigan himself is obviously a man of he's engineered some interesting things. I almost feel like, especially in the online era, like you mentioned, if you're going to come up with some utility, you're basically giving that away to the world at that point. Like you can't really do the same thing to the same degree. There's all these tools coming out that allow you to really data mine a lot of the pro demos. Just the fact that the pro demos are available now for pretty much anybody to grab off of HLTV is another thing that obviously wasn't always the case. And just for the fact that you can now sort of harvest that data as much easier as well. You don't even have to necessarily open up CSGO and use the jank demo viewer to the same degree. So I think that also contributes to it. And just the fact
that every
that
team has an entourage now. That's they've all got an analyst. They've all got a backup analyst. They've all got like 6 consoles, monitors, computers. They're looking at every game, and then they're just stealing it, And I think you've got coaches like Xtaz, coaches like Zonic. They're gonna steal it immediately. They know what's going on.
Yeah, at the very least, they might run their players through the drill once or twice, just so that the players know what to expect when they're on the receiving end of such a strategy. I think it could be a really useful tool for any sort of team that's trying to compete, if you can just harvest that data and put it to use, like you were saying. So in that sense, when you lay out all of the contributing factors, do you still feel like mousesports surprised by not being able to make it to double digits, like you said? Like just getting 2-0 almost seemingly without being able to put up a fight in either one of their series?
I mean, you got to look at it like a surprise. When I did a breakdown of their game against Astralis, I did pat myself on the back. I did say, I don't know how long they're going to be able to keep this up, because it did feel like a little bit kind of somewhat counterable in that, they made a clear adjustment between, more banana favored style to like a more heavy mid style, like just taking fights in mid, sometimes just like flash triple peeking middle, something they did that just destroyed Astralis. They were really sticky on arch side, doubling arch a lot, especially against Astralis, which is something I think you saw Vitality and a couple of other teams in the tournament try against Astralis to limited effect. I think Astralis, kind of dealt with that gap in their game plan. So I was questioning if it was necessarily going to hold up, but if you told me they play Astralis and Vitality, I'm expecting them to take them close. I'm expecting them probably to pick up a map. Maybe Inferno isn't. Maybe Inferno doesn't hold true the same way, but yeah, I feel like you have to be at least a bit surprised that it's this one-sided.
Yeah, I have to agree with that as well. I can't imagine, like, especially since they had a little bit of hype coming into this event just based off of their recent form, and for it to come crashing down so heavily. I think Kerrigan sent out a tweet something similar where he said something like something to the effect of, oh yeah, this is a horrible way to end the year and stuff like that. So he was feeling it, but I think even he and even members of the team, you can sort of speculate based on that. Like they kind of expected them to be able to take these teams close, even though they ended up being the finalists. Maybe that sort of puts it's like putting a bandage back on a bullet wound. It's like, oh, it makes me feel a little bit better, like take some painkillers or whatever. But I still, got shot. I still lost the event and still bombed out in pretty grievous fashion. So not really 100% sure where their head must be at. Like at this point, I'm especially with the rumors early in the year where Kerrigan was rumored to potentially be taking one of the mousesports players and hightailing it over to FaZe Clan to replace Nico.
What do you think of that?
I mean, are we talking, does it make sense, or are we talking, would it be banging in the server?
Does it make sense? Do you think they're going to bang out in the server? Like,
I think if that happens, that would probably be the funniest ending or I guess next step in the Nico saga, just because sort of like what we've been seeing with the most recent drama with Alu and Ents, which I have very briefly caught because I was away while that
I'm well into that. I'm well into it.
So you might be able to speak a bit more on that as well. But one of the things that I really enjoy is I'm a guy I'm not an aim star. I'm not a mechanical god. I've always, in any game that I've played, I've always been more about the strategic aspect and try to outposition or outmaneuver my opponent. And if I can outbrain them in that way, that's how I find victory. It doesn't really matter. I might whiff a really easy shot, but I might get into position to take that easy shot even. And, you still got to give me a little bit of credit there. So because that's my personal bias and my personal skill set, I always love when you got the aim star and he's like, fuck this leader, get him out of here. And he kicks him. And then, the inverse comes back to bite him in the ass when he realizes, oh, that guy was actually doing more than, my aim star friends can do, or a different thing, and obviously Alu and Nico have both been examples of this exact trope. So when that comes back to bite them, when the chickens come home to roost, that's always very deeply satisfying to me personally on a very biased level. So yeah. I have to say that would be fucking hilarious. I would love that. I'm not sure about actually like how Kerrigan would use the talent. I think, obviously he was able to use Bemis in a better way than coldzera and Nico were able to use him on the FaZe roster for his limited debut. I already thought that was kind of a funny wrinkle to the story where Bemis ends up being somewhat underwhelming despite Nico personally saying that he's a really good player and he sees him being maybe not in the top 20 of HLTV, but very high up in a year or so. And then for him to go straight to Kerrigan's, under Kerrigan's mentorship and shoot up in terms of people's estimations. I thought that was already kind of funny. It's like, oh yeah, I did what Nico couldn't do with this player, something like that. And so I already thought that was pretty cool. For that whole roster to swap over, I assume Kerrigan would be taking Rops. That seems to be the consideration there, is if he's going to take a player. What do you think about that?
I think Rops makes sense. However, you see Rops, he's got more of like a lurker, like a pretty like controlled style, right? He wants to take engagements that he knows he can win. And you put that on a team with coldzera, and I'm not sure you have like potentially overlapping styles. Now, Rops is the obvious person to take. Rops is like clearly in form when he's played with Kerrigan. He's struggled outside of Kerrigan's systems in the past, right? But is that the right player for FaZe is the question, right? Because that could cause its own issues. Now, I believe Kerrigan could make work with that. He can make it work. But I wouldn't be surprised if like Frozen might be the player, if only because basically Frozen is just a young player and he's only done well under Kerrigan. So it's definitely possible that he's got like a link there, wants to follow Kerrigan to the next team. It's also possible the same thing for Rops. I don't think either would surprise me. The only one that would surprise me a lot is if they brought Chris J. Like that wouldn't make that much sense.
That would
but
be
other than
funny.
that,
I mean, I guess then you could have like Chris J, and maybe he could organize a couple of the people, the older players on FaZe, like Kerrigan and coldzera, who have been around for a little bit longer. Maybe they could like come together and form some sort of I want to say like union, but maybe some other word would work better for legal reasons, and they could come together and do some, do something great for the scene. But that's the only advantageous aspect of putting Chris J on that roster. I think. I don't think anything in the server makes any sense.
Yeah, Bemis has been pretty impressive as well. It did feel like, at times he's felt. I think a lot of the time what happens with these new players when they come into the scene, it's like they feel like they have to play safe and they don't have that like killer instinct. Like one of the things that Zywoo had when he first came in, one of the most impressive things I saw from Zywoo is it was like, I think it was on Inferno for sure. It was like round 30 or like round, they're down 18-17. He buys an op with the mid spawn and just dry peeks down mid CT side Inferno. And it's like, if there's a good chance there's an opper there and you just immediately die, right? But like, if you think that's a plus EV play, like that's a play that's going to get you more round wins than it loses, you have to make the play. You actually just, you can't not make it because it's a close game, right? And he had that killer instinct in like one of his first events to be like, we're down 18-17, I'm making the play that I know is a good play, right? You look at a lot of other players, and I think Bemis is one of them, where like, they're not comfortable making that play unless someone like kind of holds their hand and says, no, it's fine, you make that play. Like, you're going to make that play. You're going to play a bit more aggressive. And I think when you've seen him on mouseports, you've kind of seen him open up a little bit and be more confident to make those sorts of plays as time has gone on.
I think one of the really cool things about any rising star, like obviously Z was a crazy example of the killer instinct idea because he basically plays as if he was already he came out of the womb with an op in hand, basically. Like he's good to go, Some people come out with like a tuxedo and a suitcase and they're ready for the business world. Zero came out with like an op and Kevlar, and sometimes not even the Kevlar, because sometimes he'll just force buy that shit and go up completely glass cannon and still be able to make some results happen. So one of the things that I really like about any rising star who, again, doesn't necessarily rely on comfort, but is more so able to sort of fill whatever needs to be filled in terms of like the given scenario, and they don't like overthink things and they don't get overwhelmed essentially at LAN. It happens so infrequently, and obviously we haven't seen any LANs to necessarily know if that would happen for some of these other players, which maybe is one of the reasons why we might be seeing that happen more often, is because things are a little bit more comfortable externally to the game itself. Even though you're still playing Astralis, you might be playing it from your bedroom or something. So there's something about that helps, I think, for some of these newer players. But I have seen a bit of an uptick in behemoth obviously is an example of this, where you do have these players who play to a higher level than we would expect a rookie to play. And I think even though NaVi is not exactly a rookie, obviously he was on I think it wasn't Gamer Legion. Was it Gamer Legion? Was it the team that he was on previously? Something like that. I
can check.
You can fact check me while I'm still talking.
I'll fact check you, buddy.
Yeah. So
he was on Heretics. There you go.
Okay, yeah. So the French Gamer Legion, basically. So yeah, he was on French Gamer Legion, and he was talking about like just the fact that he was still playing tier 2 CS. That meant that he wasn't just straight out of FPL like behemoth felt like, right? So it was still a little bit different. But I think NaVi also, like you were saying earlier, before we went on air, you were talking about how he still plays like he plays aggressively instead of playing to play safe or playing not to lose. And I feel like when we have players who are tier 1 rookie status, who have not played at the highest caliber of opponents and the grandest scale stakes of tournaments, this is something that many people were thinking about, even Yakinder over in Flashpoint when he was going into his final. Like, it's not Lamb, but is he going to have some nerves because this is like his first major prize pool era final or whatever to that extent. So there's just been a lot of considerations with these rising talents, and I feel like maybe the online era made it so that they were a little bit more capable of handling that in a way that those rising stars don't really get that opportunity when there's LANs every week or so.
I actually, I want to put it kind of on Xtaz as the coach of Vitality, to some extent. I think you're right. Like, if you're not playing on LAN, it's a little bit easier. There's the extra nerves that come in with coming on LAN. But like, I think one of the most underrated aspects of CS from a player's perspective is confidence. If you're just confident that you can do stuff, you're going to frag 20% better, 30% better. And then if you actually can do the shit, and you're not confident in it, you're going to play way worse. But if you get the confidence and you can do it, you're going to play 50, 70% better. And you have these players that come into tier 1. Of course, the first tournament you have, am I good enough? Do I belong in this roster? Maybe I just let my teammates, pave the way. Maybe I let them take the initiative, and I just, have a bit of a backseat. I just don't make mistakes so I don't get cut, right? Like that, having tried out for teams in the past, like one of the things you want to do is like, well, I don't want to get, I don't want people thinking I suck, let's just kind of play it safe, which is a mentality you can't have. Like, you need, as we both said, the killer instinct of like, you have to have the confidence. You have to know a play is a good play, so you're going to make the play. I think that a player doesn't, even coming from tier 2, you don't go on Vitality and play against Astralis and have the confidence unless some outside factor is helping you with that. I think for most people, like ZywOo, sure. Like he's fucking superhuman. But like, you have Masuda. I think with Masuda was a little bit slower. But then you have Navera, and they just play like they're ready. They play like they're tier 1 players, having played in tier 1 for a while, taking engagements they know they can take. And I think that's either goes on the team, or that might go well into the hands of Xtaz, like giving them that confidence, telling them to play their way. And it might go into having a 6-man roster where you just feel like, well, I'm an Inferno specialist, so I'm going to play Inferno like I know how to play Inferno. That might actually be part of it.
I want to talk to you about the 6-man roster thing, because both of the teams that were in the finals ended up using this to some extent. We even saw NaVi swapping Flamey for Bit in early drafts of their play against Astralis as well. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is whether or not the 6-man angle, since we were just talking about the up-and-coming pros and stuff, I feel like that might, in a weird way, in a way that maybe people haven't considered, actually reduce the pressure on that 6th man, because you're here for a specific reason, unless you're Bubzkji, and then in which case we don't know why the fuck you're there, but you're there for a specific reason, and you're there for a specific map or a specific player replacement or something to that effect. Like, you've got a decided role, and it's not to the same extent of trying to memorize everything else. Like, you can be, like you said, an Inferno specialist, specialist or a Dust 2 specialist or whatever the case may be. And I wonder what that does to the overall way of how these newer players rise up, how a potential like new recruitment, even if it's an established player, do you bring them on because you know that their stats are this crazy on this specific map or with this specific combo? To some extent, I still feel like we're jumping the gun if we say that this is going to be the standard. Not only is it really expensive to have just a 5-man roster, so like that obviously puts a strain on the economics if you're going to bring on more. But I also just feel like it's almost too good to be true to consider the idea that the whole CS scene is going to have rosters of talent that are deep enough that they can have bench players that are good enough to play at a tier 1 level when those bench players could be playing full time elsewhere. So until like the whole scene adopts it, I don't really see it working out as like a solid alternative to the tried and true 5-man method. But I am curious as to what your thoughts are, having seen 2 teams get to great success. I guess 3 with NaVi going all the way to the lower bracket round 3 here, which is sort of like going to semis. I'm curious as to your angle overall. Like, what do you make of the 6-man stuff?
I actually think, there's a point to be had that, not only are they specialists on the map, but you can bring in a player. Every player's, they're going to have their level, but every player's going to have maps they're just a little bit more comfortable on, right? Maps that they just do better on, especially when it comes to like kind of emerging talents. I think having maps that you're good on and maps that you're bad on is significantly more common, right? So if you bring in a player, not only can he be an Inferno specialist, maybe Inferno is his best map, it's his most comfortable map, and you kind of like farm confidence by sending them out over and over on their most comfortable, their best map in positions that they want to play. And then they have that confidence that, that you really need to do well at that level. So you're it's kind of like, it almost feels like development to some extent. You're bringing them in, and you see it with hockey. That's the only professional sport I watch, but you give them favorable deployment. You deploy them in against easy matchups. You deploy them against in the offensive zone draws, like stuff like that, where you're just not throwing them in the deep end the way typically you'd be throwing them in the deep end when it comes to professional CS. So I think that's actually a pretty big factor in it as well. Then, when it comes to a player like Bubzkji, I don't think he's intended to play. I think that's a very unique situation. Bit doesn't feel the same either. It feels like Bit is like the replacement for Flamey, and they're just like giving Flamey his last chance, like it's your last dance, Flamey, have a chance, it doesn't feel quite the same as the way Navarro's done it.
Just give me 1 sec here. Got a brief interruption, and then we'll be back. All right. Sorry about that interruption. We are back now. So you were just talking about Bit and how Flamey and the Flamey Bit relationship is a bit potentially rocky. They might be just giving Flamey his last legs. I was curious as to if you wanted to elaborate on that, because I kind of cut you off there. So,
yeah. I mean, I just don't see Bit being deployed in quite the same way. It almost feels like, I don't know, when I look at a six man roster, I expect them to be a little bit more kind of unique in the way they're deploying that single player. But I think especially because they're replacing I almost said Shocks. They're replacing Flamey, who's kind of one of the lower performing members. He's given some okay roles and he doesn't really perform very well with it. It just doesn't feel quite the same as the way they brought in, Navarra, where it feels like he's kind of a specialist on a map. And although, they're bringing Bit in for specific maps as well, got a different feel. I don't know how to describe it. Like, maybe this is a cop-out answer. It just feels a little bit different. It doesn't feel like, a true 6th man.
It's also the most recent one of the ones that we've mentioned, right? So this is the one that came in
I haven't
just for this tournament, I believe, so far.
Yeah, maybe we just haven't seen enough quite yet. Maybe he hasn't had time to develop with the roster, but that's the way it kind of feels. It doesn't feel the same. That's all. You know it when you see it.
Sure. One of the things I actually want to talk about NaVi a little bit more in depth anyway, because one of the things that I thought was really interesting about their run in this bracket so far is that when we see them 2-1 Astralis, that's a pretty big statement game, particularly since I believe, the one that Astralis took away was 16-14, really anybody's game on Inferno. That was the one that Bit obviously stood in for. And for it being his first appearance with the roster going up against Astralis, who have been on a tear recently, I'm sure there was a little bit of pressure there potentially. And so, you're not giving him the easiest route into the whole pro scene at tier 1. So for sure, I thought that resulted in something that was pretty compelling to watch in general. I remember that series much more than the 2-0 by Astralis in the lower bracket. And so I have to wonder, given that all of these tournaments, especially the bigger ones, seem to be this double elim stuff, Astralis might be the worst team to defeat in the at any point, and then still have to play them at any other point in the future in the tournament. They feel like a team that can really just adapt to whatever you did that got you the win better than literally any other team. So what do you make of Astralis's eventual victory over NaVi in the lower bracket? And I don't know if you saw enough of both series, but did you make of it any sort of things that stick out about the fact that they eventually did beat NaVi?
I think when it comes to Astralis, they're far and away the best, tactical team. And you have to see teams like, Kerrigan's talked about this. You don't play tactics against Astralis. You play puggy, you play aggressive, you take risks. When you're taking risks, if you give them, 2 BO3s, that's potentially 6 maps to capitalize on those risks, there's a good chance they're gonna win one of those best of threes. And I did catch a good amount of Astralis and NaVi, especially the first one. And if you look at the way NaVi beat Astralis in the first series, they easily could have got 2-0'd. They didn't have the greatest T sides. They won one buy round on T side against Astralis, which came down to a 1v1. So they easily could have got essentially shut out on T side of Nuke. And then they just knocked them out in CT side. Astralis got a total of 8 kills over 6 buy rounds on T side of Nuke. And some of the ways, like, they had some clever strats. They had a round where they delayed outer smokes. They dropped a molly on vents before outer smokes and a nade to bring Bubzkji, like the mini players that, the typical vent rotator, when outer smokes come in, they knew Bubzkji was going to try and drop. They hit him to like 10 health before he was able to drop as they went lower. He rotates in at a bad timing. They catch him off guard. He still gets a kill and hits the other guy for 90. Like there's a similar thing happened with simple dropping with 10 health and picking up a 3K with the AUG. These are not things that you're going to have happen back to back to back. This is not going to happen every day. And so when you do it once, you play them once, and then you go into the next, series, I think they easily could have got 2-0'd in that first series, and it wouldn't have been crazy the way the way Nuke played out. You go into the next series, and they tried to catch them with a bit of an off pick. And I've taken a look at that train game. Perfecto had 4 kills. He went 4-21, and that's a game where it does feel like I mentioned this. I'm not sure if I mentioned this on air or not, but it does feel like NaVi play kind of scared, especially Perfecto. He's got a bit of a role. He's trying to use his utility a little bit later in the round some of the time, and it's important he doesn't die in his specific role, but it feels more than that he just, when you've got electronic and simple on your team, it kind of feels, especially when they're, somewhat aggressive players, it feels like if I don't die, we can win the round. As long as I don't fuck this up, we have a chance to win this. You see, it's a little bit different with Vitality, because it feels more like Vitality is like, well, if we set Zywoo up, we're going to be in a good spot, right? Whereas with NaVi, it feels like, if we don't fuck it up, we can win. And then so you just don't have that type of aggression. And there are some gaps in kind of the flow of the way the map breaks down, where Astralis was reading NaVi pretty heavily. And, again, Perfecto went 4-21. I don't think necessarily through many faults of his own. They were, there were some. He's kind of like 4th, 5th man out. You walk out 4th man out into a 2v5. You're not really winning that round very often, right? It doesn't go their way. And then the most hilarious round I've ever seen was Perfecto misbought on their CT side. He misbought and bought head armor and couldn't afford a molly, which, as a solo inner player, you absolutely must have a Molotov to hold inner. That's the round Astralis rushed inner. So they just came down lower ramp. He's got no molly. He has like a nade, does like 50 damage, but there's fuck all you can do in that spot. And it's just like, I've watched a lot of Perfecto. He always gets a molly. This is like the one time I've ever seen him on a buy round without a molly. And Astralis, I think, they know NaVi, it was kind of a force-ish. It was like not high money. And when they don't have an op, a lot of the time they play heavy on 4 outer. So I think that was the reason Astralis went inner. And it's just like walking into I don't know what's what's the analogy here? You walking into a candy shop, everything's free. Like they just walk down the ramp. Oh, there's no fucking Molly. It's like, oh, round over. Thank you. Appreciate it. See you next round.
I feel like whenever somebody is going to actually try to analyze the flaws with Navi, they have to look past all of the shit discourse that we normally have to deal with when we talk about this team and their failings. Because you get like the people who just sort of watch Navi because Simple's on the team, and they're just like, look at like Simple's doing all of this epic work and he's carrying them so hard. So all the rest of the teammates must be the problem. Where obviously the answers have got to be more nuanced than that. And then you get the people who are actually fans of the roster, and they're maybe sometimes struggling to come up with a reason for why certain players should or should not be cut. And they almost always go for some very like low hanging fruit, very surface level attacks or analysis. And I just can't help but feel like when we're looking at this Not a Sincere lineup, I can't really put my finger on it. I'm not just saying this because Perfecto went 4-21 or whatever his scoreline was on Train. I can't really I can't analyze what he's bringing to the team as well as some of the other players, right? Like even Flamey feels like he brings a little bit more of a solid sort of rock in that respect at least when he's on. Obviously, that's the name of the game for Navi is almost like hope that all of your players are on. Basically, like Simple's almost always on. I don't remember the last game that he didn't go simple mode on. I think it was earlier this year, I believe, where he had like 1 or 2 games where he went in the red with his KD. But for the most part, his rating has been pretty high. So just the stats test and plus the eye test when you watch him is absolutely ludicrous. Just today earlier he secured a 4K against FURIA to win the map, and that was with first 2 kills being P250, where all he bought was P250 armor and whatever utility he had. So the fact that like Simple's going off, you can pretty much rely on that all the time. And then when you look at all of the other players, you sort of understand where they are. I don't really get what Perfecto brings. There was that IEM Katowice run where I think he went deathless for an entire CT half on Mirage. And that's as the B anchor, where you're not really seeing that much action anyway. But at the very least, like still, you managed to go deathless. That's pretty impressive. And so I think that got people sort of acquainted with him in a way that maybe you don't normally get acquainted with a player like Perfecto with his certain style and with his spots in the same manner. So do you think that if you had to decide to bring in Bit more on as a 5-man, a 5th man instead of a 6th man, would Perfecto even be a proper candidate to be replaced? Or is there any sort of player here that's like very obvious, not only is obviously underperforming or ending up being dead weight, like we sort of alluded to Flamey being on his last legs at this point, but that you even have an adequate replacement for? Because this is, obviously the CIS scene has been a bit of a doldrums when it comes to replacing players, especially for Navi, because they just tell you to break out the bank and try to sign a blank check away for this player because they know they're going to Navi. So it seems like there's a comedy of errors here, similar to, Perfecto not buying a Molotov. It's like there's so many different issues had to go right. Like Astralis had to decide that that's the round that they rush, and you had to fuck up your buy. And all of these other things had to go just right for this to happen. I feel like the same thing is true for Navi. Like you got to be from the CIS scene, which limits your pool of talent to a specific few. And then all of those teams have to say, fuck you, pay me whenever you want one of our players. And so you pretty much only get that. So what do you make of this whole situation?
I mean, it's not even fuck you, pay me. If you heard what it was Force, right? Force said, yes. I thought they would pick up what's even the player from Force? There's a specific player from not Jerry. Well, Jerry would have been a great pickup, but I thought they would pick up Flit. That's who they apparently went for over Perfecto. I thought that was a great candidate to pick up. He's a great player. And they said he's not for sale. And it's like, hold up, wait, that's not how this works. He's not for sale. We're not interested in selling Flit. It's like, it's going to be tough to get, good roster moves when that type of thing happens.
Yes.
And people do put it on Simple. I really genuinely don't think Simple is the reason his teammates underperform. I think it's more than that. I mean, like I said, when you've got both Simple and Electronic on the roster and they're pretty aggressive players, Simple will open a lot of rounds for you. Your tendency as a player is to just don't take any risks. We're just going to chill back. We're just going to let Simple and Electronic do their thing, and we're going to try and close out rounds when we can, right? And obviously you have Bubzkji getting, Bubzkji is pretty confident, gets pretty aggressive, but you see it especially out of Perfecto. It seems like his job is don't fuck up. And I don't think that's like necessarily a particularly conducive style. And I think it ends up with Navi having a style that I don't think is, the greatest, right? They can get things done when they're, all performing, which is something you can say for every team, right? If all 5 players are popping off, you're going to do pretty well. But unless their players are consistently performing, I think, they're kind of somewhat readable in that, you know what you're getting out of NaVi, you know how things are going to be running a lot of the time. I don't think they're somewhat tactical, but they're not quite all there. I think they've got ideas on maps, but they're not like fully, they're not perfect, I don't think. Um, so you end up with this roster that's got all this talent, and they can definitely do great things, but they just can't do it consistently because they haven't really found what they need to do. And I don't think replacing Perfecto is the play because, if you look at some games from Perfecto, he's never set up to get anything done. He's just kind of like walking into the bomb site. If his team has got the kills, then he's good. He plays the after plan. If his team hasn't got the kills, he dies, right? It's almost like, he went 1 in 14 on T side train. He could have picked up 1, maybe 2 more kills. It's like he never really had a chance to get anything done because his team just wasn't opening the bomb site for him. So is another player really going to fix that? Probably not. And, if that's the style they're going for, where they have players that are like, so dedicated in that type of situation, first off, it's going to ruin their confidence to some extent when you're in those types of situations, which is going to make it very hard to get things done. And, I don't think another player is going to make that much of a difference in that style unless you bring in like Zipniks to just clutch a bunch of times.
Well, that's the other thing too, is that if we're going to say that this seems to be more down to a stylistic choice, or maybe his roles, Perfectos that is, are not being used properly, or he's not being assigned to the right amount of resources for him, a player like him, to actually get anything done beyond what he already is doing. At that position, it's more about how the team is utilizing him and how the team's strategy is in general. And the other question that's related to the Navi roster and their results has to be asked, in my opinion, and something that I guess doesn't really get asked very often anyway. But when Simple is pulling you ahead of all of these other teams, it does feel like obviously the dream would be Simple going to a team that can better support him with different players and stuff. There's the dream of roster moves where Simple is going to another team as opposed to bringing players to Simple. But for reasons that I've been told, sort of like behind the scenes, when it comes to Navi's roster, that pretty much is not going to happen. Like, he seems like he's a lifer with that org for now. So given that that's a circumstance, is Simple actually disproportionately propelling Navi beyond what they need to? And what is it actually to overall, not through any fault of Simple's own, to the detriment of the rest of the roster, where they're sort of getting used to Simple and Electronic and Bubzkji being aggressive, and when those aggressive plays don't work out, or for whatever reason the aggression doesn't even manifest, like they don't even attempt it for one map or one round, they seemingly don't necessarily have the game plan or the tools necessary to play a more passive style. Do you think that that's a fair characterization of the current Navi roster?
I think that's exactly the issue, and that ends up in this spot where Vitality seems so amazing, just with the way, just it almost feels like you're forced into a certain style. Like if you, for example, like if you play with Simple, right, what are you gonna do? You're just gonna try not to die so that Simple can win you around, especially if you've got Simple and Electronic, both aggressive players, right? You play with Zywoo, what are you gonna do? You're gonna run in first so that Zywoo can trade off of you, right? That's a very different dynamic, right? And you need like a strong system around that to like make it work in either direction. And I'm not sure that Navi necessarily have that. I don't know what change they would need to have that. If they brought in Jerry, I'd be confident in his ability to do that, but I don't think Jerry's going anywhere. And I don't think Bubzkji's IGLing is like so bad that they're going to pinpoint it and say, this is bad, we need to fix this. I think it's not perfect. I think, the system isn't great. But the IGLing is fine. So they're probably not going to bring in, an IGL to fix that, even if they could. And that's, I think that kind of belies part of the problem.
Do you think that there's like you referenced Bubzkji's calling? Do you feel like he actually is the big up and coming IGL that everybody's saying? I mean, some people have speculated that due to the online era, we might just have a Blade be the one who's actually doing a lot of the calling. And given that there's circumstance, we can't necessarily falsify the idea. I'm not sure if there was really a massive stylistic change from Navi going from online to offline, or vice versa, rather, when they went from IEM Katowice to online events earlier in the year. So I can't necessarily say that there's a lot of credence to that theory just off of the eye test, but it does feel like we were sold a bill of goods with Bubzkji that as a community we never really saw play out in the server, where he's supposed to be this like this up and coming IGL that is essentially
Well,
supposed to
was
be
he
like top one
IGLing
CIS
before
IGL.
was he was he IGLing before he joined the roster? I thought they picked him up and then had him start IGLing. Am I
Yeah, Zeus
misremembering
picked
this?
him up specifically to IGL, basically, is what I was understanding. And then
Yeah, I
I
think
think
he
he was
picked him
out.
up to like mold him as the
Yeah.
IGL, right? Yeah.
But
Yeah, I
Blade
mean,
also was the one who said this guy is like the caller. Like that was something from Blade, not from
yeah.
Zeus. Whereas like Zeus's eye test might be whack as fuck because he kept like Edward around and so on for so long. So you can only imagine what the fuck is going through that guy's head. But Blade, in the other hand, is supposed to be, you know, he's conceptualized as like a much more thinking man's coach, where a lot of his opinions seem to make sense. He's got a vision for the game, and so for him to be able to pinpoint this player, I want him on my roster calling specifically because I think he's going to be like the next big hit, the next prodigy of CIS calling. I haven't really seen that play out in the server.
I mean, he like I said, I don't think he's bad. You know, I don't think they're getting like super out called or anything in mid rounds where the caller really matters. I think some of their stylistic stuff is just it's a style. And as you know, a professional poker player I know has said many times, style is another word for a weakness. If you've got a style, they can know what your style looks like, and they can kind of counter it. And I think that's part of the reason that Big has done so well in the online era. Is if you look at them, they've got their own style to some extent, but they've got they really vary things up when it comes to timings, when it comes to like utility. They make sure everything's masked. They do enough different stuff that it's really hard to read. But when you have an online era and you have like a very clear style and you have an online era where people can just break down the minutia of everything you're doing, they're going to find timings. They're going to find, when I was coaching, I was going, I've gone through, heaps of demos and said, in this time frame, especially on train, which is something I noticed Astralis, stacking inner a couple of times. In this time period, there are no outer hits. There's only inner hits. This is something that a lot of teams fall victim to. Between like 120 and 55 seconds, we never hit outer. We only hit inner. So teams can just be overstacked inner on those rounds to deal with that. I think that's the type of thing NaVi has a tendency to fall victim to. Because they've got a clear style, they've got a clear pace, a clear way they play about the game to a certain extent. I think I think bringing in Bit could be a bit of a change on that. No pun intended. A bit of a change on that. Because he can play more aggressive, and if they impart the confidence for him to play more aggressive, I think they can definitely have a different look. The question is, with that different look with Bit in the roster, is that the same look, every time that Bit shows up, right? That's another question that I'm not sure NaVi has the answer to. So I don't think Bubzkji is, the best IGL of all time. I also don't think he really gets out called all that often. I think it's, other things in the strategy preparation beforehand that are kind of the problem.
I think it's an interesting conversation to have regarding NaVi, though, considering when people try to pinpoint their style, their eyes are drawn to Simple and all of the stuff that he does in the kill feed. But conceptualizing what happens as a result of his teammates, there's sort of a thought process going on in the chat from Dr. TV Ready, I think is how you're supposed to say that guy's name. But he said something to the effect of like, if teams know about Simple's positioning, especially on like a CT side, then they might be encouraged to execute away from him and against his teammates, which might also result in them getting tested more often. And as a result, maybe that's why they try to play safe or something to that effect. There's a lot of different smaller factors that go into the idea of why there's why you would even consider Simple to potentially be a root or one cause of a stylistic issue, especially if you do agree with that poker friend of yours that style is another word for weakness. So
Do you agree with that one?
I think there's always going to be something about whatever, if we call it style, if we call it like your way of breaking down the game and your vision for it, whatever you express when you're in the middle of playing a game, especially on T side, I think, where your expression is a little bit more freeform and the CTs are supposed to be playing in response to you, unless they're super aggressive like FURIA or something. So in a situation where until we see like a lot of CT aggression, I think it's most apparent on T side when a style is well thought out, well drilled, and really part of the team. And in those situations, it can be a really big strength because you know that style in and out, and you know its strengths and weaknesses yourself. I do think that it becomes true. It rings true. The idea of its style as a weakness rings exceptionally true when you have a situation where the teams, like you said, in the online era can study you and they can download you and they can figure out what your weaknesses and strengths are, just like except like the sort of what is it? The Tower of Babel answer here is if you know that they know, then how much do you really know? And if I know that you know that I know, and so if it just goes down to that sort of like nested insanity rabbit hole. But the idea of a team knowing their own strengths and weaknesses to their own style is one thing, and that means that they can plan around for certain eventualities. But if the other team also is not only aware of the style, but also its characteristics, its strengths, its weaknesses, its flaws, that's an area where your style can be your weakness. It can be your undoing because there's only so many different things that you can plan for before your brains start to explode as a player or as a caller even. So that's where I think we would have to see, like when I brought up the Bubzkji angle, it's like, it's not that I've seen him be bad. It's just that I haven't seen him be good or bad. I think he is almost like an invisible force in the calling role. And I'm sure he's giving direction to NaVi, but I haven't seen NaVi deploy any of like even the really low hanging fruit but big memorable moments in calling where like obviously the Kerrigan's claim to infamy in the Boston Major that C9 won was like when he horribly misread every single time what C9 was doing, and that's like something that sticks with your head as like a flaw but also like a great strength of the enemy team or something like that, you know, where C9 sort of called their bluff or C9 did something that FaZe didn't expect. It's like you don't even really notice when NaVi have been read or when they have read the opponent, or you don't really feel that to the same degree. When I'm watching a NaVi game, it much more closer resembles a situation where you're experiencing like watching a team, not necessarily pug out either, because there's certainly structure to it, but it's like you've got generic pro team plus really heavy fraggers. And like that seems to be the dynamic as opposed to a tactical team with fraggers, which is I think more of what we're seeing out of Vitality, which is the obvious corollary given that they've got the star power to equalize against Simple in that sense. They're the only two teams that you can really compare in that respect. And Vitality feels like they bring a lot more structure, which might be because, like you were saying earlier, the player roles, obviously you're trying to trade your life for ZywOo's so that ZywOo can actually do his crazy shit. Whereas Simple is the one going in and doing his crazy shit before you even had a chance to contribute. Maybe you throw a flash for him or something. That seems to be pretty much it. So bearing in mind the player's own, you know, their roles, I think that you see a very different look with relatively similar ingredients when you compare those two. And maybe some of that is Xtaz as the coach. I definitely think he's potentially underrated. He seems to be getting a little bit more credit now that they've beaten Astralis in the grand final of this event. But you know, certainly that I think he has a say as well. And Apex calling as well. That's something that I think people haven't really been talking too much about. The fact that he's apparently the in-game leader in game as well, which again, we can't even know during the online era how much in-game these people are. That's the other thing is like, how do you even know if Bubzkji is doing the limited calling that you can feel and the strategy and like the layered tactics and the structure? How do you even know if that comes from Bubzkji or if that comes from the on the fly, always talking coach, if that even is happening?
I think when it comes to it, like the IGL matters less the more you can game plan for your opponent. Obviously, you need an IGL that can make the correct calls, the correct reads. You know, you're not walking into stacks all the time. He knows, he knows what certain, plays will kind of mean, the rotations, all that type of thing. You need someone that can do that, obviously. But if you can game plan really strongly against your opponent, you don't need a great IGL. You don't need, someone like Glaive. You don't need that type of thing. And when you come into the online era, I think that's what you see. You see teams game planning, especially Vitality, game planning really well against their opponents. And then you go into game and does the IGL matter? Yeah, sure. But I don't think it needs to be, you're not really digging. It doesn't feel like you're digging deep quite as much. When you have like a game plan and we're going to run these strats a little bit more often against this opponent, we're going to do this. I don't know, maybe some people might argue the opposite, where when you've played the same opponent so many times, you feel like, what really matters is the mid-round calling. I personally feel like, if you game plan against these teams really heavily, then the IGL needs to be good, but doesn't need to be, doing anything too clever the way you might when you get into a LAN final. And especially when, you get into a LAN final and you're in these spots where you're just like, you've run the same strats the whole event and you've run the whole same strats the whole event, so you kind of try and adjust based off that. Whereas when you're constantly, if you're constantly evolving your strategy and then game planning pretty heavily, it's I don't think IGLs matter quite so much.
Well, I guess Astralis would have agreed with you since Glaive was on medical leave for a little while. We had Magis come in and do his attempt at calling. So what I have obviously a segue in that department as well. But before we talk about Astralis, which I know both of us could talk about for quite a while, I wanted to get your opinion on any of the other results that we saw. So just briefly, I'll rattle them off, and you could tell me if any of them are interesting enough for you to comment on, or if we should just move straight over to the final. We obviously have OG falling to both Big and Furia. OG made it all the way to the finals of Flashpoint 2, so bit of a narrative there potentially. We go to Furia themselves. Obviously, they lost to NaVi and also dropped 2-1 to G2 previously in the quarters. G2 themselves didn't make it very far in here. They ended up getting 2-0'd by Astralis after losing to Big. And then Big seemingly almost had Astralis' number on a comeback on Nuke in the upper bracket final, but were eventually 2-0'd themselves by Astralis. So are any of these things sounding interesting to you, or should we just skip all the
Furia. I think Furia is an interesting one. Not even from like this event perspective. I think Furia is an interesting one from my own perspective in that they have the most clear style, right? They segueing kind of from what we were talking about before about styles. They have the most clear style, and it's it's a blessing and a curse, I suppose, because they're so good at their style that other teams can't necessarily do it. I think other teams have kind of missed out a little bit on Furia. They push the limits of what a timing means. You know what I mean? If you're playing a game of CS and you fight someone on like long A on Dust 2, and then you have a timing window in your head, like between this time and this time he could end up middle, and Furia will beat that timing by half a second, and you don't even realize it because no other team in the known universe does pushes that timing to the same extent. I think some teams are missing out on that, and it makes them super scary to deal with when someone, you're on CT Mirage, someone could literally be in CT spawn, 20 seconds into the round. I think that makes them incredibly tough to deal with. I think, it would be nice if they could, adapt a little bit more and not be so reliant on that style, because I feel like it makes them a bit one-dimensional to some extent. I think other teams need to be picking that up a little bit more often as well. And I'm not sure too many teams have. It's always felt a bit odd to me. Maybe other teams have tried it, but I think that's something that like you want to work into like a cohesive strategy. Is you want to have a couple of rounds where it's like we're running down into window this round, like straight into window, and we're gonna see where it goes from there. But you can see when you can only run that strategy, it doesn't necessarily end up working out all the time for you, except for when you can pop off with all of your players or when you're catching people off guard like they were when they first kind of blew up on the scene. G2 is definitely one to look into, but I haven't done. These games are literally played at 3 a.m. for me, so I haven't really looked too much into G2 because who cares about Nico? I mean, who cares about Nico?
Yeah, I don't know. Tier 2 CS, man, I'm not really a big fan of that, but we'll have to see. Maybe he can be a tier 1 CS player someday. I don't know, but
I really enjoy just as like just as like a drama thing, the fact that Nico said that he didn't really have much say in the roster, and then the moment like a week later,
yeah,
he goes to G2 and it's like rumors that Kerrigan may rejoin FaZe, and it's like, wow, the world really is out to get Nico.
Yeah. If you actually believe him, then yeah, you must also believe that everything else is mere coincidence. So
yeah, it's hilarious.
To your point about Furia, I do want to mention like CT aggression as well as a concept feels like until we saw Furia and teams sort of aping from Furia, or maybe it's just convergent thinking where they all sort of come up with similar concepts, but it feels like CT aggression is a bit on the rise lately. And I think especially we remember the memorable round where Furia exec as CT side onto the B side of Inferno, and they just throw their own like T side exec, but they're not the T's, as like a retake because they pushed all the way down mid. That was pretty hilarious. But like aside from stuff like that, they still have that feeling of as CTs, you never necessarily know where they are going to be. If you're a T side going up against Furia, it almost feels like you've got to get a bit of CT mentality into you just to deal with all the potential positions they might be playing, or the strats or stacks or anything like that. I think we've seen stacking in general a lot more often, like gamble stacks, which might be based on reads, might be based on planning, like you were saying, where you don't necessarily need the IGL as much as you might need a lot of planning to know based on this gun round or based on this pistol round or whatever buy you assume they are having. Maybe they'll run this strat and we'll know very quickly if they are based on a timing or something like that. There's so many different things that kind of contribute to this. But I do think that CT, in general, CT aggression is going to be one of those things where we're going to experience more of that as time goes on because it's proven to be so effective, especially in a world where the economy favors the Ts, I would say disproportionately in CS history. So what do you make of how FURIA is doing it? And then I guess more broadly speaking, how teams are adapting to being a bit more aggressive on their CT side?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to note is when you're talking about like, knowing people, the way people are playing, if you think about that, the Glaive, I think 3K against Liquid,
Yeah.
I can't remember what event it was at. It was, they knew exactly what was coming. It's like, okay, we just line up here, crosshair there, they're going to nade stack, I'm going to get the 2 kills, like it's you really catch people off with that. When it comes to CT aggressions, I think that is part of the way that you want to be doing it. It's part of the way to remain a little bit more unpredictable, and also to shift a bit more towards potentially saving when things go wrong. You either win the round or you end up saving with plenty of players, so you can build the loss bonus, you can build the stack, and then you go from there, which I think is, I don't like that that's what CS has devolved into, but that's kind of the way it has devolved. Um, the only thing is, when more CT aggressions come out, what are the timings of the CT aggressions? Are, because every player ends up having a lot of their own, tendencies. Even if as a team you don't have a lot of tendencies, each player is going to have a tendency to end up in a lot of different timings and a lot of different reads they have. But especially when you have better reads, I think, of the way your opponents are playing, I think that also leads into better timed CT aggressions, better success rate on CT aggressions. If like, well, here's a gap in their timings, they're typically not A here, or they're typically solo here, or stuff like that. You see CT aggressions work out a lot more often, right?
I've definitely noticed that ever since FURIA has come to Europe as well, they had that like onboarding period where they had to acclimatize to the higher level of competition, to the different styles and all that stuff. And obviously they got banged out initially, but they were able to take it to some of the teams. And even in this event, they seemed relatively competitive. I mean, OG dropping 0-2 to Big before moving over to take on FURIA. Both of the games that OG lost were relatively close, as 16-12, 16-14. And then the series against OG that FURIA played, I mean, there's a 16-13 in there, a 16-12. It doesn't necessarily seem like OG are, they're not going to slack off. They're not going to be these teams that are just like super easy to break. They certainly didn't roll over the same way that mouseports rolled over, admittedly against higher degrees of competition at this same event. So it's not enough to say that FURIA are like write them off at all for any example. I definitely think that they've proven to be up there with some of the best European teams, and as a result, you could just say the best CSGO teams. But one of the things that struck me about when they came over compared to when they were before is they almost had to find a different way to take the aggression in a way that wasn't going to get exploited by the higher levels of play, basically. Like against North American teams, it felt like they could just rely on having those teams red, which is obviously something we keep referencing. But also I felt like there was a big component of that worked to against FURIA and to the other team's favor, in that these teams, it's not like FURIA is the only aggressive team in Europe. Like there are other teams that have run that kind of aggressive style, maybe not to the same degree, maybe they're not as defined by it, but I think maybe one of the reasons why we even defined FURIA by their aggressive play style is because relative to other NA teams for the better part of the year, which is all their competition was, they didn't really have the same level of aggression, whereas we have seen aggressive plays come out of a lot of the other teams. So I guess it's just something that's going to be happening more frequently in the CS scene. You did mention, though, that you classify this sort of style that we're seeing as a bit of a devolution. Can I ask you a little bit about what your more preferred method of playing CS is? Like, is there a particular pro meta that you look back fondly on, and sort of like the Wolverine meme where you're sort of like caressing the photo? Like, what's going on there?
No, I mean, I think the meta is always like constantly shifting. It's almost like a living thing where it's, you see certain things added in, it adjusts, and sometimes you see it kind of come full cycle. full circle. Especially if you look at a map like Overpass, where the meta was like heavy towards the B side, then it was you would have defaults where you take short, and then it kind of shifted. You had defaults more heavily over to the A side, and then things that worked before because team it just comes up back into its own little circle with the way some of the meta of a lot of the maps have gone. When there's not a lot of shifts, I think Overpass is a map that if you really look at it, there's obviously progression. There's new things come out that stick around for a long time, but then you have a lot of things that kind of do end up in a circle of the way it works. And I think the same thing might happen with Inferno when it comes to like banana control and forcing in mid stuff like that. It's gonna it's probably gonna end up coming for full circle again. But when you look at like CT aggressions, things like that, they are kind of just brawly CS to some extent a lot of the time when it comes to CT aggressions, which isn't necessarily what you really think about when you look at, when I look at like beautiful CS, right? I think of like Astralis, making sure every corner's flash. One of my favorite teams back in the day was Copenhagen Wolves, I think it was. Copenhagen Wolves. And they were just like, it was when they had, who did they have on the roster? They had some, I
They
think
had
it was
Glaive on the
MSL.
roster at some point.
Was
so,
it Glaive? Yeah. They the roster I'm thinking of had, not a lot of huge names, but what they had was like every corner, every time they peeked it, flash there, like every aggression, there was like there's someone there to trade, stuff like that. When you really think of like, flawless CS, but a lot of the time in pursuit of flawless CS, you leave openings, you leave problems, and that's the reason I think you look at a team like Liquid. It's no coincidence when Liquid picked up Stewie, they became the best team in the world, or like significantly better, because Stewie added in this aggression where it's like, is someone going to run through that smoke? Is someone going to be here at this extreme timing? We have to utilize we have to use our utility more consistently early than we would otherwise against a team that only shows slow paced, methodical CS. And I think there's a reason that you see, with the exception of Astralis, just about every dominant team in history has had that X factor of like craziness. JW for Fnatic. You've got, Fur for SK. You've got obviously Liquid, Stewie for Liquid, as I said. You've got these like aggressive players who force the opposing team to be honest, is the way I put it. They have to use their utility early, because you could just run through a smoke and insta-give people. And Astralis, I don't know, man. Astralis is just so good. They don't need it. They have it to some extent, right? It's not that they don't have it, but they don't have this crazy player who you expect it from. It's more of like a, Dupree might do it. You might have Magis do something crazy, right? They really kind of brought it down to a science in a different way.
Do you think that that's changed with Bubzkji in the lineup? Because obviously this is something we're only seeing it on Nuke so far, but Bubzkji was touted as this very aggressive player. It's one of the main reasons why people were very surprised to hear that he had been picked up by Astralis of all people, because Astralis seems to work best when they have players that, like you say, bring it down to a science and don't necessarily color outside the lines, so to speak. And Bubzkji is very much a player that seems to like that sort of aggressive style, where we haven't really seen that so much in the demos that I've seen from the Astralis Nuke games, but it does feel like Bubzkji would have been a stylistic mismatch early on. Do you think that he's bringing something that Xyp9x is not bringing when it comes to his few games so far?
I think this is gonna just put it how it is. I think the thing he's bringing is that he's good. Like Xyp9x, like actually, if you watch the Astralis game versus NaVi on Train, NaVi were really trying to isolate Xyp9x, and Astralis wasn't having it. They were, Xyp9x was having, a good game for himself. He was definitely fragging along with the boys. And they were, a little bit protective of Xyp9x as well, it felt like, on some of the rotates. And I think he's just like, I think he literally just took all the time off and he came back a bit rusty, because when you watch him on ramp, which is a spot where you necessarily end up in a lot of 1v1s. You necessarily end up with players that are trying to lurk out on you, that are trying to catch you off guard, and the little things matter. And so you see when, if you really, like, if you take a look at Xyp9x on ramp, he was using his utility a bit earlier than Bubzkji or Esatag have. He was dropping without getting a kill more often. And, you'll hear analysts say, just surviving on ramp is the key, which is true. But I think the the actual second key, to the latch is getting a kill before you drop. If you get a kill before you drop, you put your team in a very winning position, and Bubzkji will do that significantly more often than Xyp9x. And he takes a few risks to do it, but I think it's actually Xyp9x taking not enough risks in that regard that has ended with them. They were 14-2 or 14-3 with Esatag on the roster, 1-5 with Xyp9x on the roster, right? I mean, that's it seems obvious to me that they would bring Bubzkji in, not even just because they hate Xyp9x, but because something's got to change, right? Your best map turns into your worst map. That's something's wrong here. And I think if you look into it, Xyp9x just plays a bit scared, especially on that CT side. Bubzkji plays a bit over aggressive, and again, I think you're right in that it's not really their style, and they'll probably phase Xyp9x back in and not use Bubzkji ever again if they can do it. That's what it feels like to me, because it really feels like last case, it's their last chance. They just wanted to try something, especially because when I looked at them versus FURIA, Astralis versus FURIA, I think they played in a previous tournament, right? Am I smoking?
I believe so.
right
Yeah,
now?
I'm not sure which one it was because there's a new one every week, so can't tell you more than that.
They did play FURIA in DreamHack Masters. I looked at that series and I thought I gave the edge to FURIA specifically because I expected FURIA to pick Nuke. I expected them to run a strategy where they would isolate Xyp9x. And FURIA is a team where if you can't win the 1v1s, sometimes you're just going to lose, right? So I thought for sure they'd lose Nuke and you'd go 3 maps where FURIA has a chance to win the series. And, Astralis could win it, but, they definitely lose Nuke. Then that was the first game where they subbed in Bubzkji. And, he didn't do amazing, but I think he did his job a little bit more so than you see from Xyp9x, where, he's, especially because, you see these micro changes where he's more confident in his ability to duel, so he holds his utility a little bit longer. And Astralis is a team that are very consistently strong at bringing a second player to ramp when ramp gets pressured, but you need that little bit of extra delay. You need your ramp player to be a bit more confident to actually hold for a second. And you can see a lot of the time when Xyp9x was there, it felt like the rotate was just a couple seconds off, 2, 3, 4 seconds off. You see Bubzkji there, the rotate's there a lot more, I think.
I've noticed that Bubzkji, this might just be a default ramp thing. I haven't looked too heavily into other ramp players, but I have noticed that he likes to pop the window in control, I believe it is, the lower level B-site window.
Yeah.
He likes to pop that window pretty frequently just so that he can make that fast rotate all the way up without necessarily making noise beforehand, which I'm sure has been done before anyway, but that's like one of those areas where maybe even Xyp9x also did this, but it feels like just by virtue of seeing that drilled into you over and over again when you watch his POV, it does feel like Bubzkji knows that his role isn't just to sit ramp and wait for lurks to pop out and take those fights in that less risky fashion. Maybe you do need to abandon ramp just to get into position in case there is a lower hit because your team's got to read in the middle of the round, or because you just know that this team likes to prioritize that. So I have noticed that Astralis do feel a little bit more comfortable now. A couple of games in with Bubzkji on Nuke, they feel a bit more comfortable around that ramp position than I've noticed them having that same level of comfort elsewhere. It almost feels like it's normal Astralis ramp or normal Astralis Nuke again, which for every other team is a horrible idea.
I've seen a few moments of Bubzkji where it's, Glaive was on, I think HLTV confirmed, and he says, Bubzkji, if you're listening, just play a little bit less aggressive. That's like, I don't know. It's like, I really hated that he said that like on a podcast.
Of course,
like,
yeah.
Can you not communicate that to your teammate off of the podcast? If not, why? Like, and if you're bringing it onto the podcast, it feels like there's something behind that. It feels like there was like some argument or something. I don't know.
Well, Astralis and podcasts this whole year have been fucking hilarious. So you can't. I mean, maybe it's more of what they don't say usually, but in that case, yeah.
But I mean, like, what's that necessary to say? Like, what was the point of saying that on the podcast? Because I feel like a lot of Astralis is like pretty calculated with that type of thing, and it's like, what was the goal there? But I have seen a few moments where there is, as analysts brought up, there maybe when they were confused about NaVi picking it, they were looking at maybe Bubzkji. He's a good player, but maybe they can isolate some of the rotations. And I've seen some rotations that were like Bubzkji drops to rotate, but Glaive was rotating already, because usually like the way it works is you have your ramp rotator as your second rotate, unless it's a squeaky drop. It's a squeaky drop, your ramp rotates and he covers lower because you can't drop behind the squeaky drop. You're just going to die, right?
Yeah,
But
simple
I've
will
seen a
knife you in
few,
the vent or
yeah,
something crazy.
yeah. But if you're mini player, which would be Glaive, or one of your upper players, if you're playing Glaive outer, can't rotate, then you rotate the ramp player. I've seen a few times where it's been like Bubzkji starts rotating, but no, Glaive's already rotating, and then you end up with a bit of confusion there. And I've seen a few times where Bubzkji is kind of like against, especially against force buys, I've seen him a couple times just overstay his welcome, looking for that extra frag, looking to re-aggress into ramp. Which is probably part of why they talk about being him being a bit over aggressive, but at least he's got the confidence to win the duels. And again, I still think that they're probably going to phase Zipnix back in as long as he can pick up his old form. And it seems like he's kind of moving forward in that way from what I've seen. I haven't really looked directly at the stats though.
We were talking a little bit about this before we went on air, but I honestly was not sure that Bubzkji would ever play a game under the Astralis.
I didn't think so.
Org,
I didn't think so either.
Yeah. It feels like, again, to the point where you don't know why they have ever brought on all of these other players if they weren't going to use them, or if they were only going to use them for a game or two. You have to wonder what the fuck was going on with that 6-man, 7-man, 8-man, however many men roster plan. And the fact that it's so transparently like in front of our faces fallen apart compared to what they were talking about from the higher up, the PR managers or whatever that was going on there, where obviously we had that Nikolai colon or whatever it was for device. It was like, on the tweets. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can go off of that are completely external to the game. Do you think that Bubzkji himself was like behind the scenes practicing for this? I mean, I imagine they must have decided, hey, we're going to try to do this, but I'm just so perplexed as to why they essentially took like one of the most aggressive star players off of Mad Lions and turned him into a social media manager for months.
Yeah, I mean, you can only speculate that, some things have been a little bit awry. I love that, I really love that the initial narrative was Astralis 6-man roster. Astralis is gonna do, and then it's actually Vitality that's the first team that really hits home the actual 6-man roster. That's not just like, oh yeah, we as soon as Zipnix is back, we're gonna use this guy. Or if we can't get rid of Zipnix, we'll get rid of Esatag and use Zipnix or whatever the theory that they went for was, because it's not a 6-man roster. It's a 6-man, like in my opinion, it's a 5-man roster, and their nuke was utter dog shit, and so they had to make a change. And when you change out Esatag for Zipnix and you go from 14-2 to 1-5, the obvious change is Zipnix for Bubzkji. It's at least they've got that option to them, I suppose, but it's not a 6-man roster. It's not a 6-man roster. It's really not.
Even Vitality using their sixth man for more than just one map as well, and like actually sort of swapping out what the 5-man lineup looks on a map to map basis instead of just one specialist map is also really interesting to me. I feel like you could talk a lot more about the strategic implications of just shifting around like who goes where, and the fact that Ziwu is now like rifling more than he's opping on Inferno because you could bring in Navera, but then I think it was, is it Dust 2 or is one of the other maps that Vitality like to sub certain players out for? I think, Shocks is there. But
Dust 2 and Inferno, I believe, are the two maps.
Those are the two maps that they like to do. But it's a different 5-man lineup for each map. It's not like it's the same one. So
if you look at Navera, his stats on those two maps are unbelievable just in general.
Right, yeah. And so it goes to show like there's ways to actually apply this in a way that doesn't need to take you like 5 months, 4 months, however many months Bubzkji's been technically signed, but not actually been able to play a match. So under those sorts of circumstances, you do have to wonder what might be happening when it comes to the roster moves behind the scenes that may or may not have been talked about or may or may not have happened. I guess the only thing that I'm really curious about is like with Vitality beating Astralis at their own game with their own sort of PR gimmick, if you can call it that, they're actually making use of it. Like you were saying, like the first team to do it, but also the team that really actually tried to make it happen and makes Astralis look like fools, especially when you lose to them in a grand final with, the same team in question. So do you think that this matchup was always going to go this way? Like, did Astralis have a shot? Did it feel like when you were watching this sort of grand final? Did it seem like they could have done something a little bit differently, that the fixes are obvious? Or, like, for example, I'll give it to you this way. Obviously, Navi 2-1 to Astralis and then lost 2-0. If this had been the lower bracket matchup into the grand final, and we saw Vitality defeat Astralis first, would Vitality could, in theory, would they have been in contention to defeat them again?
Ooh, that is a tough question. I mean, you have to assume so, given how one-sided both the two maps that Vitality won were. It didn't feel like Astralis had much of a chance on Vertigo. They just got absolutely run over. I think that was Masuda that had the best performance he's ever had on Vertigo. And then on Inferno, it felt like they ran them over as well. It really felt like Astralis had no opportunity. You do have to also, though, you have to factor in that they did play big just beforehand. They did immediately before this series play big in a best of three. And, it didn't go all three maps, right? Well, immediately beforehand. I think there was like a 30-minute, 1-hour break or something. But they're a bit more exhausted, so it's hard to say how this series may have actually played out.
Yes.
If the teams weren't exhausted, if Vitality was the one coming from the lower bracket, and could have been the one that studied some of the the semifinal or the lower bracket final of the opponent. It's really tough to say. Do I think Astralis would have learned and kind of digested the information from Vitality and beat them in the rematch based on that? That's a tough question, right? Because I don't even know, it's hard to say if Vitality would necessarily have won initially. However, I do think there's a good chance that them coming from the upper bracket also gave them extra time, because when you're looking at Astralis versus Big, there's a pretty good chance that Astralis is going to win that. You're probably prepping mostly for Astralis, and that gives its own advantage, right? If you have Astralis versus Navi in the lower bracket final, I don't want to take anything away from Big, but I just feel like, stylistically, I don't think they match too well against Astralis. I think Astralis is going to beat them most of the time. And so if you had Navi versus Astralis in the lower bracket final, you also could have had slightly different situations, right? Because although Vitality is just a great team and they went into the final with a good plan, they did, there are things that they adjust against Astralis that, may not have been able to be realized otherwise,
I'm looking at the match breakdown right now, and I'm seeing that Vitality scored 12, 10, and 12 CT rounds on their CT halves in all three of those maps. So it's 12, 10, and 12. 12 on Vertigo, 12 on Inferno, 10 on Dust 2. The fact that Dust 2 is the closest map is 16-14 for Astralis. It's really tough to say that that Astralis would have been able to do it. Like you said, like the domineering nature of Vitality's victories, it feels inescapable. Like maybe you could have gotten double your score, but it wouldn't have saved you in those rounds, in those games. So it does feel to me like, as adaptive as Astralis has proven to be, Vitality just seems like they were, I guess, destined for some sort of victory in this upper bracket. In this grand final.
I mean, you also have to admit that, right? That Astralis, or Vitality rather, had RPK going ham on Inferno, right? And when you have your last chance, player on the bomb site picking up 3Ks, right, from a corner, and just getting every kill, those are the types of players that I've considered even making a video on this, where sometimes it seems like you look at a player and it's like, if he has a good game, they win every time. And it's like, well, yeah, because he's not really put in the greatest spots to have a great game. So if he has a great game, that means that a player who's not set up for greatness is making it himself, right?
Yes.
So I think RPK, if he does a bit worse, if he doesn't pick up some of the rounds, there was a few rounds it felt like where RPK was like the last chance. There was, I think it was a 2v4, I think, where he was on the A site against Pistols, on the close left box, cold zero box, we call it. And he just picks up a 3K spray down. It's like, you're not really expected to get more than one there, right? So, another day, another game, does he do that? Maybe it's a bit closer just based off that,
That's one of the really interesting aspects of Pro CS, for my money, is conceptualizing how you can make it so that even if your players don't have an A game, but on their B and C game or however far down the alphabet you want to go, they can still contribute. And I guess on some level, you need to hope that your stars always have at least a B game. And the superstars are the ones that can always have an A game. And then you get up into like A plus S tier with Simple and Ziwu. But that is an element where I feel like there have not really been that many teams who have been able to survive. Like in the grand total of pro CS rosters, there's a ton of them that have relied very heavily on essentially ensuring and banking on star talent delivering. And that's one of the really compelling things from my money about Astralis back in the heyday is that their players, even device included, didn't need to necessarily pop off and have an A game or an S game in order for them to win an entire tournament because their structure was that good, because their style, if you will, left so little room for a weakness to be attacked. And there's obviously a case where if they just don't frag out at all, like if you're giving this to a bunch of like a silver elite masters or something, it doesn't matter how good your tactics are if your aim isn't there. But like if you can't shoot the people, you can't shoot the people, you can't get the kills, you can't win the game. But there's something about Astralis compared, like old Astralis compared to what we currently have. It's rough to call them out in this way because they did just make it to the grand final and they did have a pretty good tournament, all things considered. But I do feel like the key thing that's holding them back right now is that their players actually do need to pop off more than they used to need to in the same way. Back in their era of the last year, they didn't need to have really standout games every single time. Device always seemingly delivered, but a lot of their players were very consistent with what they did. They didn't necessarily have really highs or high highs or anywhere close to low lows in that sense. And I want to hear your take on Astralis's roster in terms of how they may have indeed relied a little bit heavier on the star talent. Do you think that that's an accurate description of Astralis currently? Like, do they have to pop off in order to win games more so than they had to in the past?
I think it's seeing a pretty big shift in the way Astralis is kind of going, how the players are performing, how things are going. Even just off of Magisk not calling anymore, it seems like he's kind of really hit form, hit stride again. And you're talking about Device would typically be a player that would pretty consistently do well. I think Magisk is also a player where I think Astralis, one of their best attributes is you didn't typically have like C games come out. I think a lot of people understand the concept. If you haven't seen it, I believe it's DDK and Elige that was, one of the first podcasts or interviews to talk about it. You didn't really have players hit their C game very often, so you consistently had like their B game, and then you're looking at them getting their A game. And you've always got Device, showing up, and you've usually got Magisk showing up, and so you combine that with like a really solid structure that sets you up for success. It gives you gunfights that aren't all that complicated, aren't all that hard, and then you've got your IGL putting you in positions where you're constantly hitting the weaker bomb site, you're constantly stacking the correct bomb site. You don't really need to do anything too crazy to get a win in those situations. Then you come into Astralis currently. I think players are hitting their C game a lot more often than they had in the past. You're having games where players do just bomb and do just very much so miss frags they should, miss trades they should, things like that. So it's hard to really say, but I think, with Glaive back as the IGL, you're seeing them kind of pull off that Astralis magic, I feel like sometimes too, where they really are just consistently against a lot of teams, just hitting the weak bomb site, stacking the right bomb site. There's just something special about Glaive with those timings of just catching people off guard. And some teams have kind of caught reads on that. I think you saw it. I believe it was Vitality that sometimes were just having a really good counter read against that. But I think over time, Glaive is going to be able to, manage that himself, bring it back together and see where that takes them. But I think, part of the problem is that you are having players that I think typically used to be highly consistent, not be quite as consistent. And the question is, what is causing that? Is that because they're changing up the roster so much that they have no consistency there? Because it felt like with Esatag on the roster, things were pretty good, right? Things were going well. Then you take Esatag off the roster, you bring in Zipnix, and I feel like, Zipnix, at least the first couple of events, was not doing all that well on certain maps specifically, and then you have to kind of overcompensate. And if you have to compensate for a weak player, then you've got a problem to begin with.
Well, that's one of my next questions anyway, was related to Glaive on the come up and being able to transition away from Magisk doing all the calling and have Glaive come in and essentially take the reins back again. Do you think that Astralis are on track to get back to their 2019 era form where essentially the scene was defined by either them or Liquid winning, and eventually it went back to Astralis? There's that little ping pong in the middle where they kept, serving it to each other for a couple months or whatever, but Astralis were the best team in the world for a really long time, and Sadikist called them the best team of all fucking time. Unfortunately, that they left that out of the whole tournament edit video. I was missing that fucking part. But the whole idea behind Astralis as the top dog, they show moments of that greatness. Like you're saying, some of the players don't rise to the occasion. They'd still linger at around their C game level. Do you think with Glaive at the helm back again, and with a roster that may end up being, in fact, consistent, like you're suggesting potentially they just phase Zipix back in, do you think that Astralis are on track to become the best team in the world again? The best team of all fucking time?
I don't know. I think it's going to sound so, like, I don't know, cliche, so lazy. It's really on the players. I feel like they still have the ability to get back to that. They still have the ability to do it. There's nothing stopping them from just, they did it for 2 years. When are they going to fall off? Nobody knows. But I think they are at the point where this is like, you win for so long and it's like 12, 15-hour days and you're just like exhausted and players are feeling exhaustion. And I can't help but think they might feel a little bit like unhappy with the way, the org might have been treating them, not letting them take, breaks. And I see it on Reddit a lot. Just want to point this one out. Astralis isn't obligated to give the players breaks. If they didn't have a doctor's note, they weren't obligated. That's not how it works in esports. Like every other major org gives their players breaks when they need it, especially orgs that have this much success. If you look at League of Legends, especially, like Doublelift took a couple of splits off, I think, just to stream, to chill, because the players get exhausted after years and years of it. And if they can get over that type of situation, if they can feel comfortable with their team, and if they can put in the effort and they've got the motivation and they're not burnt out, because even, if they've got the effort or the motivation and they put in the effort, being burnt out or, experiencing some form of burnout is going to make you, just not play as well, not do as well. So if the players are mentally in form and they're putting in their best effort, I don't see a reason they couldn't. Now, will they is another question. You have to give them the benefit of the doubt, I suppose. But it's really tough to say,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was speculated is that they're waiting until their contracts expire and they're just sort of playing nice. But
wouldn't surprise me at all.
That angle makes sense based on what I know and what a lot of people have been talking about in general in a public-facing environment as well. I don't have any insider info on this thing. I just mean that when you consider the org and the way that the org and as by extension the players have essentially just been dragged through the mud in terms of the court of public opinion, at least with a sizable segment, like they're always going to have their fans, but a significant portion of the sort of water cooler partaking individuals out there, like the people who are on Reddit, the people who are on Twitter in their replies section, there's going to be a lot of talk about, anything that Astralis does is either going to be, you're going to have the praises sung by the fans and the haters are going to come in. And even the people who just have legitimate criticism or legitimate praise, and you don't have necessarily fall into those like loaded term camps, it still feels like there's a lot of conflict just based around the org themselves. So maybe they are just playing nice in that sense. But I also feel like when you're a champion for that long and you've proven that you have that kind of mindset, it's very difficult to turn that off. You know what I mean? Like I can't imagine these players feeling happy about the level of play that they've been displaying up until more recently when they found a bit more success with Ezatag and then now with Bubzkji as well as Zipix. So it only makes sense, I guess, that they would want to, maybe they also want to strut their stuff for potential buyers towards the end of their contracts as well. So there's a lot of reasons why you might think that they would be turning it back on now, but I also think that there's just been a lot of shit that's been going down behind the scenes, and some of it bubbled to the surface. And now we got a bit of a good look at what's going on there, and it wasn't as pretty as we wanted it to be. And I think the players also know that. So there's got to be some sort of like external pressure on them from that angle, just alone.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. You're right. It's hard for players at that level to turn that type of thing off. It wouldn't even be that crazy for me if well, the thing is, when are their contracts? The question that I've always had is when are their contracts signed? Because the smartest thing Astralis could have ever done would be to sign these players to contracts of differing lengths or
Yes.
at different times in the
Yes.
year. Because if they are signed to contracts that end at different times, then they're probably sticking together with Astralis. But my opinion, since near the beginning of this year, is if they're signed to contracts that end at the same time, I don't really see them re-signing with Astralis. Based on all the publicly available information. If I want to repeat some of the stuff that has been stated on stuff like By the Numbers, Zipnix apparently was being shopped around. The whole roster was being shopped around. Apparently they didn't want to lose Esatag, but they couldn't find a buyer for Zipnix or something like that. The whole team asked for a break, near the end of 2019 or at the end of 2019, not given a break. They had Glaive, mentioned the medical leave, and then Zipnix is like, "Oh shit, you're allowed to do that? Like, see ya." Like, I think it was Glaive that did the announcement. Zipnix was like, "Peace the fuck out," right? It could have been the other way around. I'm not 100% sure.
It sounds right
But
to
it's
me.
like,
So yeah.
yeah, it's like, everything that's been said and everything that's happened with Astralis suggests that if those contracts all end at the same time, there's a good chance they just don't ever fucking re-sign, and then they take a 2-month break and they find another org as a full team. Like that wouldn't surprise me all that much, to be honest.
Well, we're talking about stuff that's publicly available knowledge. We're talking about the lower hanging fruit of the internet's discourse. I figure this is a good time as any to segue into what I feel will probably be our last topic of the show. And I wanted to ask you a bit about your favorite pet peeve Reddit narratives that have been going on lately. So I think this will be a repeated, recurring segment of this show where we sort of dish out some hate on. We give it back just like we had to take it by reading your comments. So let's hear the first one. It sounds like you've already got a couple ideas you want to start off.
Yeah. So I've got the one. If anyone read the Reddit thread of Apex's 1v1 against, I believe it was it Glaive or was it Zip? I think it was Glaive. On pistol round T side Inferno.
Yes.
Apex is in a 1v1, bombs planted. Glaive sees him go into apartments. Glaive fakes the bomb. Apex doesn't bite, and then he fakes it again. Apex doesn't bite again, and then he peeks out, and Glaive kills him but doesn't have time to defuse. The comments on this thread just really show like a lack of understanding, in my opinion, of how like even moderate level strategy works. Because like half the comments go on, not half the comments, but there's several comments that go on about, oh well, he never should have done that because that's obviously the bad play. If he smoked, like the first one I was reading was like, if he smokes off apartments, he's always faking. It's like, this is not how games of chance work. And when it comes to like a 1v1, there is a level of like just probability and chance. If someone always fakes when they smoke off apartments, then they should stick when they smoke off apartments because their opponent knows they always fake when they smoke. As you mentioned before, it's I know. When it gets to that level, it's no, you just can't, that's not how strategy works, right? And then, the follow-up comments were, well, in this game, it's he only did that because the round didn't really matter. They were up 11-4. If the round mattered, he's thinking in his head that if it goes wrong, who cares? It's one round. But if it goes right, I look like a genius. This is also not something that you. So there's a thing, an idea that I heard when it comes to like celebs shit, right? Where like you're reading fan comments, and if the good ones get to you, the bad ones necessarily get to you, because the mindset that allows someone saying, "You're my favorite, you're the best," and you're like, "Yes, I am your favorite, I am the best," right? If that can get you hyped up, the bad ones are also going to get you feeling shitty because you're allowing it to come through. You need to have neither of those affect you. Same thing goes for CS in those situations. If you can think a round doesn't matter, I'm just going to make this play because the round doesn't matter. First of all, that's a losing strategy, right? This is just not a winning strategy. And when the round does matter, now you're going to make a shit decision because the round does matter. When you look at players that get to like the peak performance tier 1 level, these are guys that, not universally, it's always going to affect them a little bit, right? You can never have pressure not affect you at least a little bit. But, they do a good job of, it doesn't matter if the round matters. You have to push that thought out of your mind. You make the smart play, right? This is the play that has the highest % chance. I'm going to make it regardless of if we're about to lose the game or if we're about to win the game. You have to just make the smart play. Again, there's sliders to that. But the idea is like, I'm only, well, if I lose this round, if I lose this round, it doesn't matter. But if I win, I'm going to look like a genius. It's
I
just not a
actually found the
thing. It's
exact
just
comment
not a
you're
thing.
referencing.
Yeah, it's not a thing. My breakdown of the 1v1 is that Glaive, Hawka mentioned, actually, I don't know if you caught that tweet.
Yes,
Hawka mentioned
yes.
that 7 games on Inferno, they don't buy kits. Actually, if you watch Astralis on a lot of maps, they don't buy that many kits. They buy a surprisingly low number of kits, from what I've seen it. And a lot of teams buy less kits than you kind of expect. On Train, for example, kits are a little bit less. You expect like a kit every single pistol round. It's not every single pistol round. There's a lot of rounds that the kits don't get bought. But Hawka mentions 7 games on Inferno, no kit. Glaive faked the bomb the second time after 7 seconds. It kind of looked like Apex was thinking about peeking after 7 seconds on the first fake. So when you actually break it down, only one fake was actually a fake, and Apex peeked out after about 12 seconds. I don't know if he intentionally did that. I think he just waited for the sound of the music, and then he peeked out, and it was longer than the full diffuse, which is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that was intentional or if he just didn't realize it was longer than the full diffuse. You can never really know. But I'm actually considering like looking into how often does the player that taps the bomb fake it? How often do they fake it the first time? How often do they fake it the second time? Because I'm really interested in the answer to that. I feel like players fake it more often. I feel like players rather check the bomb more often than they should, because nobody wants to leave a round up out of their hands. And when you don't check the bomb, it's basically out of your hands. It's like, I'm gambling that he's not sticking it. People don't like doing that, just as like a psychological thing. It's like,
Yes.
you don't have control of the outcome. That kind of sucks, right? So I feel like people check the bomb more often than they should based on the number of, the percentage of the time someone fakes. You know what I mean?
I feel like that's also the case. And I'm with you on the overall clip, the 1v1 itself. Like, it just doesn't seem reasonable to assert that the reason why he decided to do it was because he was looking for cool points. I mean, he's in a grand final, for fuck's sake. Like, I think he's more after the prestige of winning the entire tournament, and he's going to go for that percentage play more than he's going to go for something that's going to be cherry on top. You know what I mean? So just the idea. I actually, hold on, I lost the comment. I want to read it out on air because I think that's how we do this. To be fair, they were dominating and ahead. He probably thought either we lose one round or just keep dominating, or I will look like a badass. He chose correctly. Did he though?
I mean, well, I mean, part of the thing is like, I think if Glaive knew that Apex had 30 health there, the play is actually to just smoke it and plant and stick it. Because with 30 health, I think Apex doesn't really have an option but to not peek through that smoke.
True. Yeah.
I think when 30 health, no armor, by the way, so he's just fucked if he runs through that smoke. I think he has no option but to not bite.
Yeah, how do you feel about him smoking apps in the first place? Do you think that's down to not knowing the HP, or?
I think smoking apps and sticking it is the play if you know he's got 30 health. Because if he's got 30 health and you smoke the bomb, there's a lot more playability there. You come out apartments, you go on the balcony, you spam the smoke. Maybe you spam the smoke and Glaive has faked it. He's done the play where you fake it and then you peek out behind the smoke. But he spams the smoke correctly. He spots that nobody's on it because he can. It's not that hard to spam a smoke default when you're in apartments. It's actually very easy. He notices the Glaive's not on it. He just drops in a mini pit and then he wastes more time. Maybe he gets a headshot angle, all this stuff. I think the play, in my opinion, smoke it and stick it. I don't think maybe Glaive didn't know Apex was low, because with that health, like, if you really think about it, I don't know, maybe I'm falling victim to it as well. But like, really, a lot of the time, the vast majority of the time, you probably don't want to push through that smoke if you've got 30 health. Because if the guy's faked it, which is more than 50% when he doesn't have a kit, it's going to be like 80% of the time he's going to fake it when he doesn't have a kit. If the guy fakes it, you're just dead immediately, right? So like taking the risk that he's not faked it, or that he's faked it, is probably the play. Or at least waiting until the end there, like waiting 7 seconds, and then Glaive fakes it again. And then, going from there, that's where I think is game on, after the second fake. I like the idea to smoke apartments though, rather than the bomb, just because he's low health, if he's low health, because it doesn't give him that playability of actually coming out and getting information or, anything like that.
It only makes sense to me anyway. I mean, I'm definitely with you on the reasoning behind what Apex did. I'm not sure about the counterplay that Glaive could have done or something that he could have done differently there. I guess he just should have bought a kit. I don't know. That's
It's just a rough spot when you don't have a kit, like
Yeah.
it's you're in such a bad spot because sticking it for 10 seconds, like that's an
in a
eternity.
1v1. Yeah, it's impossible basically.
That is an eternity. And also when you stick it, it's kind of similar to like not checking the fake. When you stick it, it feels like the round's out of your hands. Like, does he check?
Yes,
Well,
yeah.
that's all it is.
If Glaive did the same thing that Apex did, except Glaive was holding E on the bomb during his 10 seconds of doing nothing, that would have also been Glaive titanium balls or whatever. Like, like it would have been the same sort of narrative. Like, wow. And I bet the reason for it is because, to be fair, they were being dominated, and he probably said either we lose one more round and keep getting dominated, or I look like a badass. So yeah. It's pretty much.
I don't know. It's just I feel like people that have that type of thought process are people that just like don't understand what it looks like to be at a high level in the game.
No, they've never played a grand final for sure or anything close to it because they know they like nothing else matters. I must win instead of fuck it, I'll look cool. Like that's a show match mentality, right?
Yeah, that's like the way I advise people that say they choke a lot is I say, you just have to like push it, like quietly push it away. If you ever think to yourself, this is an important round, I can't make this play, that is in my opinion the definition of like a toxic thought, because that infects every other thought before and after. Like as soon as you think that, you're fucked, right? So you have to just like quietly push that out in the mind. No, it doesn't matter that it's important because I know what I'm doing. I practice for this. This is a play that I know works, even if it's risky, because that's what happens a lot of the time. You take less risks because you're worried about throwing, right? Although some people do the opposite, but you take less risk because you're worried about throwing for a lot of people. You got to push that out and just make the play you're going to make. And eventually you push it out enough times that it just never comes in. You just never think that. That's like the mentality that, pro players with sports psychologists, I don't know how exactly they deal with it, but they're not supposed to have that thought ever in their mind. Like that is a losing thought.
Yeah. I mean, at that point you're playing not to lose as opposed to playing to win. So that's another way to characterize it, I think, is just you can't be entertaining stuff like that. And like you said earlier, the inverse of like not letting the bad stuff in, you can't just selectively let feedback come in anyway.
Yeah.
Like you can't just decide I'm only going to listen to the people who think I'm a badass. You also, in order to go looking for that shit, unless you've got somebody who you're paying to filter out all of the negative comments and only send you the positive ones, I guess that would be another way to inflate the salaries of esports orgs is get them a social media filterer. But aside from that, like there's no way you can ignore all of the good shit and like not think, or all of the bad shit rather, and not think about it. So yeah. The only other big brain comment I saw in that thread after looking back at it was somebody who said that maybe it was because coaches were stream sniping and said, "Oh, bomb went down and he's got no kit." That's pretty much it. So,
one of the funniest things actually that I've seen is like people don't understand. I feel like how much information you can get just from looking at a player, like even from just barely to the side, you can see if someone has a kit. Like if you got like a trained eye. One of the things that's actually funny that I talked with Davey about this while he was like streaming, and I messaged and noticing the gun people have when they cross mid on Dust 2. It is physically possible that you can see someone crosses Dust 2 and you see, because you see on their back they have a rifle or they don't, right? You can call that. Now, most of the time nowadays everyone smokes mid, right? But I asked Davey, like, have you ever had an opera that calls the weapon people have when they cross mid? And he's like, what? I don't even think you can possibly see that. I don't even think that's possible. And I'm like, trust me, dude, as a coach, I watch my opera and I tell the team what guns they have. Because sometimes you have like a round where it's like, are they forcing or are they saving? Right? And so you can see he's got no rifle. Sometimes you can even see the gun, I feel like. But I think you can see if someone has an op or not. It's really hard to see, but if you're looking for it, you see it.
Dude, that's why the MP9 is the best fucking gun in the game, because it goes across your front and you could hide it, dude. Stealth.
Well, I mean, like 99% of the time people are smoking cross, but it's like that's information that's given up. You can tell if someone has a kit. You can tell if when you hit someone how much blood they show, whether or not they have armor. There's all these sorts of things that go in that are information people just don't even realize like that you can get out of these rounds,
Yeah, no, there's tons of like small detail info that again, it sort of goes back to the idea that whoever's leaving these crazy comments is like they just haven't been in the situation or anything comparable, or tried to think from the perspective of what a pro might, which is harder, obviously, if you haven't been in that sort of situation.
One of the things that's interesting is I've seen Navi do this. I don't know if you have an answer for this. I was looking at this just before we got on this call. Navi, when they're playing Nuke, they throw a decoy. Like what they have is, I've seen it a few times. Perfecto throws a decoy in the same spot he's throwing a smoke, and then he goes back, buys a smoke, and throws it in the same spot the decoy is. I think there's a way that works out where you because I can't get it consistent. I really tested this. I can't get it to consistently work.
Oh,
but
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Sometimes a decoy will show smoke inside of the smoke, and you'll see the player if there's a player inside the smoke. I think that might be the idea, because otherwise, why? Right? Like, otherwise, this doesn't make any sense.
Nothing immediately comes to mind as an alternative, but the fact that the decoy explosion, or just like the sort of puff particle that it creates every time it's making a sound, anything like that will, especially on Dust 2, anything that creates a sort of particle effect when you shoot at it.
It doesn't always do it. That's the problem. It doesn't always do it. It sometimes does it. So I'm thinking like maybe if you throw it in the exact same position, maybe it consistently does it, which would be kind of clever. Simple did die because there was no smoke. There was a fucking decoy when the smoke's supposed to be at some point. So because there's always the chance that they're throwing it as a delay, because your opponent's going to throw a molly down to block it sometimes. So you're throwing it as like just so they see it coming over and they think it's the smoke. But I'm going to look into it a little bit more.
Yeah, that needs a bit more research. I would just say at least somebody's found a use for decoys. It took Valve ignoring a critical bug with their fucking game for somebody to come up with a use for decoys. Hats off to you guys, man. Don't know how you keep doing it. I still can't believe that smoke issue is in the game, though. Like, you can actually just straight up see. I think that Molotov thing can still happen, too. Like, you throw a Molotov behind the smoke. I have seen that happen on the latest patch.
One thing that is, like, a clear issue is that if you throw a smoke inside of another smoke, and someone's sitting in the smoke, I don't know how many people know this, but if you throw a smoke inside of another smoke and someone is sitting in that smoke, when the first smoke dissipates, everything inside the smoke is fully visible. You can see everybody. It's like super, super, super one-way smoke. So it's kind of a way to deal with people that are like, it's hard to like time it right, because I'm 100% sure pros know that you're getting wrecked if you're sitting inside a smoke when another one dissipates, right? So the way you can kind of counter sitting in a smoke as it goes down is you have another smoke. It bloomed just as that smoke is dissipating, and you peek out, and that smoke is going to be a complete one-way. You're going to see them. I'm surprised less teams, or not that many teams, have done that. I'm also surprised so few teams utilize nade smoke. Nade smoke is one of the most completely broken things in the game, and you can look at certain areas. I found one on short on Dust 2, near bricks. You can get it to land just on the lip over the ledge. It gives you 1 damage, but you can kill anybody plat or car, and they cannot see you even a little bit. I am surprised more teams haven't used that either.
How long until Valve actually puts in competitive smokes? How long are we going to have to wait for them to fix all these issues? Is this a Source 2 thing? When is Source 2 coming? That's the big question.
I really don't like that you can sit in a smoke and just have a huge advantage.
Yeah.
I feel like it's like,
well, even if you're just sitting in a smoke that doesn't have any other smoke coming in it, you have an advantage over somebody who's like outside of the smoke, but looking at the smoke. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, well, because there's that last little puff of smoke on the outside, right? And you don't really see it when you're inside. I think that, like, as 2020 has progressed, that is the most annoying thing I've seen become more and more and more common. And now it's just like, is there a smoke down? There's someone sitting in it. Like, it's just every fucking time. It's actually just not even fun to watch.
I won't claim to be an expert on the way that CSGO handles this stuff on a technical side, but I do believe that you can tell this. You can sort of test this in a layman's way just by standing at the edge of a smoke. Your vision is obscured based on a separate layer over your own first-person view that is not actually present everywhere else, which is probably why that other bug exists where you smoke bloom and then like the other one dissipates. And as that happens, your vision is not, like, whatever's blocking your vision doesn't get refreshed. So you're sitting in a smoke that you have full vision of or whatever. I think that's what's actually happening, because it's not like, I don't know why they wouldn't, maybe it's something impossible where they can't make sure that your vision is obscured when you're inside the smoke unless they put this thing over. But then they could just fix this sitting in a smoke bug or exploit by making it so that that vision blocking screen over your viewport, just make that last like 1 second longer or half a second longer or however long it would have to be. Like, it doesn't seem like it would be this difficult to fix, but they just don't.
I think they've tried to fix other stuff and come up with problems where it's like, well, you don't want someone outside the smoke to have the advantage. You also had the radar smoke
Yes,
problem,
like Glaive was
right?
using, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure pretty much everyone was using it. There's just all these issues that like continue to compound. And it's like, and then you talk about Valve having like Source being a pretty rough engine to work on, and it's just these things just don't get fixed unless they're a huge issue. I was super surprised they fixed the Mirage bug where you can see through the middle of the triple, right? That bug was there from the beginning of CSGO, and it's like, surely, like it. The thing is, you have to have a developer that just doesn't play the game in order for that not to get fixed for years and then get fixed when there's a Reddit thread about it, because everyone knew that existed. There was like anyone that played Mirage, it's like, oh, I can see through the middle of triple. Like, oh my God. It's like, but there's no fucking use for it, like ever, except for once in 6 years, you know? I just feel like, you know, sometimes it's a developer that just doesn't even play the game.
Well, we do have that immortal quote by Gabe Newell who says, how many people would you have to put in the server for them to defeat the top one team? So, yeah, there's all sorts of, yeah, they just don't play. I think like you're saying, it's probably pretty accurate. So,
yeah.
I wasn't sure if you had any other lazy narratives or Reddit threads you wanted to attack while we're here, since
I'm sure I have something, but I think we're over 2 hours. I think this is about the end of it. That's
okay.
about all we got.
That's all we got for now then.
I've had to pee for the last at least 45 minutes.
I commend you for holding it in. We're going to take a break now so that Vu can let out his bladder, and we will be back with another episode of ELO Heaven sometime with maybe some guests talking about maybe some tournament. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for the follows and the gifted subs. Appreciate it. Catch you guys on the next one.